in the US, and I guess I don't know this in Canada, but in the US, the symbol for a disabled parking spot is the wheelchair, and so I think there's this sort of automatic connection in people's minds between cars and disability, right? And needing that sort of like the only really visible symbol of disability we see is that parking spot designation.
Welcome to That's Her Problem, the podcast where women who lead, connect, and rewrite the rules get real about building community. The challenges we face aren't always the same as everyone else's. But here's the truth. A city that's good for women is good for everyone. I'm your host, Patty Weens. I'm not supposed to have favorites. All my episodes are my babies, and I love them all the same. But Anna Zivarts is my guest this week. Anna Zivarts, author of When Driving is Not an Option. Anna's book was recommended to us by many of my guests in their book recommendations. And even before I read her book, I just knew I had to interview her. Her unique perspective as a non-driving female, turns out, is not that unique. So much so that she wrote a book about it. If you don't know this yet, I also wrote a book. It's called That'll Never Work Here, Challenging the Myths Around Biking in a Winter City. Pick up a copy today from your favorite bookstore or request one from your local library. You can support me and my podcast on Patreon by going to pattybikes.com/podcast. My Patreon supporters get all episodes one day early, and they get to hear their names at the end of each episode spoken in a Brazilian accent. I mean, what more could you want? One of my supporters told me in person one time that this alone is worth $5 a week, never mind $5 a month. You know who you are, and I appreciate you. But before you hit that Patreon button, please consider going to standwithminnesota.com and donating to one of the causes listed on there to help families struggling due to the ICE occupation of the state. Oh, sorry. Did I forget to tell you that this show is political? Yes, it is. Because women's issues are political. Bikes happen to be political. So if you thought this was just a cute little podcast about women, well, you're right. It is pretty cute, but also political. Donate and find out how you can get involved. I'm not in Minneapolis. I'm a Brazilian Canadian, but I stand with my friends who are down there working tirelessly and helping their communities. Now, in today's conversation, we'll talk about how we need to shift away from mostly funding car infrastructure because of the high percentage of people who are not able to drive. Do you know what the percentage is? Take a quick guess. Now, hold on to that number and let's see if you're right in this episode. Another interesting topic that we'll cover is self-driving cars, like Waymo. Anna has a really unique perspective I hadn't thought about, but it makes perfect sense to me now as a woman. Let's get to the episode. Anna Zivarts, I'm so honored to have your time, and I have to tell you how cool it is to be speaking with you. The reason I reached out to you is because at the end of my show, I have a section where I ask for a book recommendation by a female author, and your book came up at least 3 times. One of them was Vivian Ortiz, whom you know, bicycle mayor of Boston.
Yeah.
Another one by Carol Villain, who has the same vision impairment you have. And she's an advocate in Santa Monica. And the book is When Driving is Not an Option. This summer, I also had a visit from Angie, a new friend and listener in Iowa City, who said she should connect us too. And I'm thrilled it worked out. So welcome to That's Her Problem.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I feel like I'm already part of this vibrant community you're creating. So thanks.
You really are. Your book comes up in conversation a lot. You know, it's incredible. It touched so many issues that I'm only recently aware of. But before we go into a lot of detail, I would love to hear your journey, your superhero origin story, and what sort of brought you to write this book, to think about these issues, etc.
Yeah, so really comes from being born with a visual impairment, right? Called congenital nystagmus that makes my eyes shake a little bit all the time. And that means that I don't see well enough to drive. And that really has shaped my life in many ways. And, sort of set me, first of all, it really, because so many communities in the US are so car dependent, and I grew up in an area that was, in outside of a city in a rural area, no transit, no sidewalks, right? Really defined sort of what felt possible to me. And I was fortunate enough to live in New York City for many years and be able to use the subway system there and have really wonderful freedom of movement. But then life changed and I needed to move back home, and I'm back in Washington State again. And, being someone who can't drive in North America, where, driving is seen as the sort of legitimate form of mobility, really sort of defines my life in almost every day, and what is possible. And so that's how I started to think a lot more about transportation, I think, than perhaps a lot of people think about transportation, and led me to finding this space, sort of starting in the disability community with other disabled folks who couldn't drive, and then sort of broadening that frame and starting to think about other people who couldn't drive or couldn't afford to drive or were too young to drive or aging out of driving or even choosing not to drive, and starting to think about how we could build a movement around this broader identity of non-drivers. And that's really where the idea from the book came from.
And you did a lot of research, you spoke to a lot of people, and you came up with some numbers of the amount of people who really can't drive. What are those numbers?
Yeah, it's really, it's about a third of the population. And in the US, I think it's similar in Canada, maybe even a little higher. I think there are more choice non-drivers, and especially in some Canadian cities, because your transit systems are just a little bit better than ours.
Oh, I don't know. Not everywhere.
Not everywhere. But in some of your larger cities, you have higher percentage of folks who ride transit. So that's really cool. But yeah, it is about a third of the population. That's based on, research that I've done, but also reaffirmed by some research that came out just a couple weeks ago, in end of September this year, by NRDC. And they found that 36, and this is just US research. I was nudging them the other day to look into Canada too. I'm like, there's a lot of Canadians who want this similar research for their communities. But in the US, 36.6% of the population over the age of 10 doesn't have reliable access to a vehicle. And so that's a big number. And they broke it down. You can sort of go into their data and look at it by census tract in different states and different communities, and look, sort of over the map of the U.S. more broadly. And it's interesting because, well, sure, there's definitely, high densities of non-drivers and low car ownership rates in some of the big cities in the U.S. There's also really low car ownership rates in some low-income rural communities as well, through sort of Western New York and the Rust Belt, through parts of the rural South. And so just being aware that it's not just big cities, that when we're talking about transportation access, we have to be thinking about people who can't drive and can't afford to drive in rural communities as well.
One of the things that you touch on is that sometimes we think we shouldn't count the kids in these numbers because kids can't drive anyways. But isn't that the more reason why we need to count them, because we need to provide safe alternatives for kids to get around?
Yeah. I mean, we all know kids need to go places. If you're a parent or a caregiver, you recognize that, from the day they're born, almost. I remember in New York, taking my kid on the subway the first week of his life to go to the doctor, right? And that's just, we needed to go in for our checkup that first week. So, kids need to go places. Everyone needs to go places. And there's not some hard line at which, someone should count as someone who needs to go places or can necessarily travel alone, right? And so some, the NRDC research, they chose to say 10 and up because that's sort of when they felt that, you could travel independently. I question that sort of distinction between independent and dependent travel. There are some adults with disabilities who can't travel independently. As a caregiver, a lot of the time I'm not traveling independently. I need to have my kid with me, right? And so
Exactly.
there's not like a hard. So I prefer to really think of everyone, counting each person, because the second you sort of try to draw lines between who has a legitimate mobility need and who doesn't, or who counts and who is a person enough to count, and independent enough to count. I think it sends us down these sort of ableist paths that it gets messy, and it doesn't feel like it is a good way of framing it. So I count everyone. Kids definitely count. And I think we recognize that when we talk about, how when we set up systems for kids to get places without parents or caregivers taking them, in the U.S., often that looks like busing for schools, right? Like our yellow school bus system, because, we recognize that not every kid has a parent or caregiver that's going to be able to take them to school every day, right? But there's a lot of value in kids being able to go to school. And if they can't, if kids who don't have that parent or caregiver who can take them can't get to school, that's a huge loss for that child and for society more largely. And so that's why we have these systems set up. And just sort of thinking about that in the context of, gosh, like, all right, you have a right as a kid, and communities where busing exists, to have that transportation. And even in really rural communities, we'll have school buses pick up kids and make sure they can get to school. And then you graduate from high school, and that right to mobility disappears, and maybe you're able to drive at that point, but maybe you're not. And that's a choice that we make as a society about whether people should continue to have access or not. So sorry, bit of a tangent there, but I think it's important. I
love the tangent. I love the tangent. I think about how my brother living in the Holy Land of Amsterdam, and his little boys who just have always been able to go anywhere they want without having to ask mom and dad to take them, right? There's times when they have to take them, but sometimes they just come in and grab their bikes and disappear, and they went to the neighbors and went a couple of blocks over, and you don't feel like you're fearing for their safety all the time.
That's the dream. Oh my gosh.
That's the dream, right? Exactly. There's times when I'm talking to him, and I've said this before on the podcast, I'm talking to him on FaceTime, and the kids come in, grab something, and disappear. And I'm like, where are they going? Oh, I don't know. It's like that creates that early independence and the early maturity in kids too, because they can get around without being driven everywhere.
Totally. Yeah. No, I think I live on a, sort of suburban area of Seattle, and, there's a bunch of kids on our block, including my kid, and they have free reign to sort of go anywhere on the block without crossing the street, right? But there's a park right across the street from us, and they're not at the point yet where they can cross that street because cars just go too fast. And I fantasize a lot about creating my own DIY traffic calming to be able to slow cars, because if cars were just moving a little more slowly along that street to the park, they could go to the park on their own, right? No one would have to take them. So that's part of living in places with a lot of high-speed traffic.
One of the things that whenever I post something about choosing the bicycle, the pushback I get is, well, not everyone is privileged to ride a bike, as in some people have to drive, and not thinking about the side of some people can't drive. There's so much privilege in that you don't see outside of it.
There is, right? And I think, we sort of, in the U.S., and I guess I don't know this in Canada, but, in the U.S., the symbol for, a disabled parking spot is the wheelchair. And so I think there's this sort of automatic connection in people's minds between, cars and disability, right? And needing that's sort of like the only really visible symbol of disability we see is that parking spot designation. And we see it everywhere. And so I think that's part of what reinforces it. And then also just, many of the folks who are, active in communities are people with cars, just because it makes it a lot easier. And so whether that's disabled people or not disabled people, you're going to see, I think there's a higher percentage of folks in the disability community that have car access that are, really active or in leadership positions or, seen as sort of spokespeople spokespeople. And the reality is, and this is from that NRDC data, so it's US specific, but 73% of adults in the US with disabilities don't have reliable access to a vehicle. And so, driving is not feasible for many disabled folks, or is not affordable because there's a lot of, disabled folks who live in poverty. And so I think it's important to recognize that. And it's also important to, in this sort of context about biking, that, yeah, there are, some disabled folks who can bike and cannot drive. And there's some disabled folks who can, both bike and drive. And there's some disabled folks who can't bike and can drive. But, recognizing all of that nuance. And, there's definitely not a lot of conversation or awareness around disabled people who bike for transportation, because driving, is not an option for them. And, I'm one of those people I've met, and I'm always so happy to meet other folks in that situation, because I think for many of us, it's not something that we have a community around. And, even with different kinds of disabilities, we can have really different sort of needs and what works for us in biking. But it's really great and exciting to have those conversations.
I have a friend here. Her name is Kirby Cote, and she is an Olympic athlete, a Paralympic athlete who has a vision impairment, and she rides her bike everywhere because she can't drive. And I'm hoping to interview her for the podcast as well, because she's a local celebrity here. And she was telling me that one of the ways that she rides her bike around is she has people teach her the safe bike routes, and they go together, and then she learns it, and however much she's able to see is enough for her to bike places. And I think that's a really cool sort of adaptation of her limitations to actually give her the freedom to go everywhere.
Yeah, no, that's so cool. I mean, one thing I've noticed is that I hadn't really thought about it a ton consciously, but I rely on my hearing a lot when I'm biking. And so when it's quieter and you hear traffic, that is actually much safer for me than when there's a lot of traffic noise and you can't hear, an intersection, what cars are approaching. The scariest for me is biking actually in snow, because it muffles all the car tire noise.
Yes,
and so you can't hear it. Like, it really throws me off, because all of a sudden there'll be cars right there that I won't have heard. And suddenly they kind of pop into my vision, and I'm like, oh my gosh. So, biking in snow with cars is not my favorite.
Last year, you wrote an article for Streets Blog USA, and you talk about your experience with Waymo, the autonomous rideshare. I guess we can call it autonomous rideshare, or self-driving Ubers, for lack of a better term. And in this article, you explained that you really wanted to hate it, but you ended up loving it. There's a lot to unpack in that article, but can you explain the issue of women's safety that you explored there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess for a little bit of background in this, so I, not being able to drive, I was living in New York City for most of my young adult life, and mostly using the subway and occasionally taxis, but not something I would spend money on very often. Then I started traveling for work a lot more to different parts of the US, and I would fly into a city, and usually I'd have someone be able to pick me up, but not always. And so I'd have to, try to find a cab, and finding taxis, before there was ride hail. When you're in small cities, you call the taxi company, and somebody maybe picks up the phone, and maybe they don't, and maybe they show up and maybe they don't. And so that was really stressful. And so when ride hail sort of broke onto the scene in 2012, 2013, and it started to be possible to fly into whatever random airport and get ride hail, for me, that was really transformational, because it was just so much more reliable. And it was way cheaper, right? And we now know that a lot of that, the cheapness was there because they were, being highly subsidized, and it wasn't reflecting the true cost. But it made it easier for me. But as time went on, I was in situations on occasion, where, and with any kind of, you getting into a vehicle with someone and you don't know them, and, you're expected to sort of, often, kind of keep up a conversation and be nice and not too nice, and this trickiness of negotiating that space. I had one ride hail driver once, and it was a really
When you
long.
say ride hail, you mean something like
A
Lyft
Lyft
or
or
Uber?
Uber. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, no, just
Yes,
clarify.
yeah, to clarify, yeah. So I had one driver once pick me up at an airport, and it was like it was gonna be a 2.5 hour drive. Like, it was a long drive we were gonna be taking together, and he immediately went off route. And it was just not a great situation. Made a lot of comments that were very sexual, and I felt really, really uncomfortable. He also started talking about his connection to guns, and like mentioning guns that he had, and I just got really freaked out. But I wasn't much I could, like, I couldn't get out
You were
of the
trapped.
vehicle. I was trapped, yeah. And then I decided to report him to the company, and then I got really freaked out because I started to reflect on all the comments he'd made about his like friends in law enforcement, and I was like, oh my gosh, he could probably track me down. And just, it was a really not fun situation. And he, nothing bad happened after that, luckily. But I deleted my my account for a little bit on that service because I was afraid that he would use it to track me down. And so, when I rode Waymo for the first time, the self-driving robo-taxis, right, in the Phoenix area, it was just such a relief to get into the vehicle and not have that sort of pressure of keeping up a conversation, being nice, being not too nice, having to sort of like explain myself to the driver where I'm going. Like, I think that we all feel, and especially as women getting into a vehicle with a strange, usually male driver, and so that part was a relief for me. But again, it was cheap, right? Because I think it was they're being subsidized, right, to get people to use them, and so it was pretty affordable, and I was none of that sort of tension around performing like appropriate levels of niceness, and those are great, and I do think ultimately that in many situations that self-driving cars will be safer than human drivers just because of how distracted and how often human drivers break the rules, right? And so I think those things are all good. My problem with it is that for those of us who can get into a taxi, that's great, but right now they're not wheelchair accessible, and there's not really any immediate future where they're going to be, and so that excludes a lot of folks. The cost will also exclude a lot of folks, even though right now they're relatively cheap. We've seen Uber and Lyft prices skyrocket throughout the U.S. As they start to reflect the real cost of what it means for someone to be driven somewhere. Driving is actually has costs, and so I worry about a future where that they undercut transit systems, and those transit systems become more and more minimal, and they undercut biking, right? Because as more cars get on the road, whether they're self-driving or not, right, that's a less pleasant experience, and to be someone trying to walk or bike or roll somewhere. And so I worry that as that sort of becomes the norm, it'll become more and more difficult for people who can't use them or can't afford to use them or would prefer not to be driven, right, to use any other kind of form of transportation. And then the last part of it is, right, that if it's really easy and cheap to be driven somewhere, we're going to be driving more, right? Individually, you'll make choices to go further places, to live further away, to work further away, to do, meet people and hang out with friends who live further away. And all of that sort of induces more sprawl and more spread out communities, which again makes it harder to, have transit work or have biking or walking work. And so I don't like the future that sort of digs us deeper into that car dependence. And I feel like that's where we're heading with self-driving vehicles.
Absolutely. And this idea of something coming into the market being cheaper, it really is sort of the norm, right? We cancel cable because Netflix is cheaper. All of a sudden, all of these subscription services that we have to have because we canceled cable are costing us more than cable, and cable is gone.
Yeah.
Uber comes in, we stop using taxis. Now the taxi industry is gone, and our only option is Uber, which is now more expensive and unregulated because Uber drivers don't have to go through the kind of training that taxi drivers go through. They don't have to be regulated. It could be a complete stranger talking about guns and making, sexual advances without any regulation or any kind of responsibility, really, any kind of consequence. What's he going to do? He can start a new account tomorrow and his record is clean. The same happens when, say, I think it was in LA that Lyft bought the bike share, and
Mm-hmm.
then promptly closed it, and then all of a sudden you can't use a bike share in certain cities because Lyft prefers if you use their car service. And this car dependency is kind of scary. You had a really great quote that I'd like to read in that article. It says, "Riding an autonomous vehicle for the first time by myself allowed me to realize how intoxicating the freedom of car mobility feels in America to people who are lucky enough to drive. It gave me a much more profound understanding of the appeal of cars." This makes me think of our connection between the freedom to move and our cars. My dad recently relinquished willingly his driver's license, and it was a really big milestone because our city isn't friendly to seniors' independent transportation. Our transit isn't well funded. They would rather spend money on widening roads. And you talk a lot about what it feels like to have the burden to always have to ask for favors. And I think of
Mm-hmm.
my mom that way. She hates asking us to drive her around. When I offer to pick her up, she says, "No, no, 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 no. It's okay. It's okay. I can drive." And that car dependency is just kind of depressing and sad.
Yeah. Yeah, that favor piece I think is something that we don't talk about enough. In that and so there was some research that we had funded in Washington State that came out in 2023, so it's a little old now, but not much. And it was about, the population of non-drivers, both just sort of understanding how many non-drivers exist, but then also what are the needs, and how do non-drivers get around currently across our state. And our state, we have Seattle, big city, right? Some big population centers. We have, a whole, like, more than 20 transit agencies throughout our state. But there's so much of our state where transit doesn't cover or transit isn't frequent enough, and there's not biking or walking infrastructure, where what the study found was that a majority of non-drivers are actually asking for rides to get places. And so, they looked a little bit in, there's a framework called the Transportation Security Index that, like, digs into sort of questions around how people feel about their access to mobility. And so the researchers in this study used some of those questions to really sort of dig in deeper about how respondents felt about, what they felt about asking for rides. And they, unsurprisingly, for those of us who do rely on rides and favors, right, felt like they were a burden, felt it was hard to ask. And it was interesting, too, because it was actually women and disabled people and younger people who felt it more of a burden, like felt it was harder for them to ask because they felt like they were being more of a burden in asking for rides. And so I think that part is interesting as well.
It's so important. I think it's actually when I got to that part in your book, I was like, oh, this is not being talked about enough. When people talk, well, not everyone can ride a bike, they're not really thinking of that person who has to ask their friends for a ride or their relatives and be that burden. It's more common than I think that we realize. And I'm glad there was some research and I found that part of your book really relevant today as more and more people are aging. We're getting
Mm-hmm.
that boomer generation aging and not being able to drive. And maybe that's what we need. Maybe that's what we need them to see, that they're going to need more options, and they're going to start to ask their city councilors to invest more in these options.
Yeah, I
It
mean,
is,
I hope so. I hope
yeah.
so. I think, part of it is, like, e-bikes are great, and I'm hoping, and I know many, folks who are, older and have found e-bikes to be a way to, get up that hill, to have a little extra boost, to be able to carry groceries, right? Or e-trikes, right? A little more stability. I think that's awesome. And I hope that continues to expand. But, we also need the safe places to ride them, right? So people feel comfortable, and store them. If you live in an apartment or somewhere with stairs, it can be really hard, if you have a heavier bike or impossible to get it up those stairs. We actually dug a ramp down to the basement of our house in Seattle to be able to store our cargo e-bike, because, there's no way I'm getting that bike up and down stairs. It's way too heavy.
Exactly. And you need it. Yeah, I saw some of the articles you wrote also about e-bike as, the vehicle of the future. And I talk about this a lot in my book as well, how e-bikes are going to change everything, because as more people start riding their e-bikes, there will be more demand for infrastructure. I mean, there's times in some of our trails that you can tell that someone who drove a big truck now is riding an e-bike by the way that they're riding their e-bike. So we're going to have to look at regulation and enforcement of, just polite behavior. It's not that hard, right? But
Yeah.
I'd rather have impolite behavior from someone on a bike than someone in a car. And we know how that ends up.
Exactly. No, and I'm hopeful, right? I mean, you see, like, when you drive around on the back of RVs, rather than someone towing a second vehicle, there'll be a couple e-bikes now. Or a lot of times when you're driving on a highway, you'll see, tucked behind, the semi in the back, there'll be an e-bike or a bike, often e-bikes, right? That the drivers want to have when they're done driving for the day, right? They don't want to sit in a car. They want to be able to get out and get some fresh air. And so that's exciting, and I hope we continue to see sort of more people pushing these forms of e-bikes further to be able to be more accessible for more folks. E-scooters, like the sit-down scooters, I think are great. I don't know if you have like the sit-down shared scooter, it's like Vio or Lime.
No, we don't have
no.
anything in our city right now. But
Yeah,
but
I mean,
I do
those are,
see that. Yeah.
pulling in a lot of younger folks and folks who maybe wouldn't see themselves as cyclists, but, are using those devices. And so I want us to think, especially in the biking advocacy spaces, to be thinking more broadly about who we define as a cyclist, and, including folks who are scooter riders and e-scooter riders, and even, including folks who are using electric, like, power chairs and mobility devices, because a lot of the needs for infrastructure and charging infrastructure and smooth spaces to roll, right, are
They're the same.
And then, how can even just like smaller golf cart size vehicles, right? And I'm very curious to see, like, as I don't know, as folks are aging out of driving in colder areas, right? If we see more like golf cart sized, winterized, right, vehicles come around, because you see them a lot in sort of warmer places, right, for seniors. But I hate the cold, so
Yeah.
I can't imagine, like, I'm not someone who's going to be biking for transportation, in the winter if I had.
Okay,
if I could be
you
in an
don't even get
enclosed-
winter, okay?
Yeah.
You're gonna have to come see what real winter is.
Yeah, no, I'm a bit of a softie. I don't like biking in the rain either, to be honest. But if I could be dry and warm, I could bike within a dry, warm, cocoon, I would love that. And so I would love to see more sort of those, golf cart size style, slower speed, electric, either pedal assist or not, but, vehicle types that become available to people who, are living in areas where, they don't need a full size SUV, right, to get around.
I agree. And if I could give anyone any advice about e-bikes, it would be to say, don't wait till you can't drive to start riding an e-bike. Do it now while you're still flexible, mobile, that you can learn how to get around on an e-bike. It might be a little bit different, but don't wait. Don't wait till you can't, because, I wish I had gotten my dad and my mom into e-bikes a couple of years ago. Even would have made a huge difference, I think. But, now it's harder. My dad is having more mobility issues, and it's just not as accessible. So don't wait too long. Do it now. right? This episode is brought to you by Shifter's new online course, The Ultimate Guide to Bike Commuting and Urban Cycling. This course gives you all the knowledge you need to make the bike a bigger part of your daily life. It's created by Kaylin Klingbeil and Tom Babin. This is so fitting because Tom's YouTube channel was the catalyst for my winter cycling journey from casual bike rider to year-round bike commuter. Chances are you're already riding your bike a lot, but you might know someone who isn't and who would like to make the transition but just doesn't know how. I'm telling you, this is exactly what they need. Find the link to the course in the show notes and on my website at pattybikes.com/podcast. So we've arrived at a section of the program that I called the Thank You, Amy section. So the question is, was there a time when you were underestimated and you used that opportunity to exceed expectations and even excel?
Yeah, I'm going to share this about writing the book because I have talked to a number of folks who, you think you have a book and then you go and you try to get it published. And I think anyone who's tried to write, a book has gone through this process of rejection, right? And I definitely went through that process of rejection with my publisher, right? And had an editor there who was wonderful and worked with me for over a year on a proposal, right? And kept on sort of iterations and iterations of that proposal until it was finally accepted. And so, it is sort of, I don't know, a little trite to say, like, don't give up. But I do think, there was sort of this, what are you trying to say? Does non-drivers, does this even like resonate as a concept? Is this for real? And I think there is still get pushback from people who don't think that like the argument that non-drivers exist and that there's a lot of us is a valid or useful argument to be making. I think it is. That's why I'm making it. But yeah. And eventually the publisher did see the value in the story, and it ended up being one of the, better selling books that they produced that year. And so, I think if you believe that you have a story to tell, and a perspective that's unique, and the powers that may not see that right away. And so continuing to sort of push for it, I think is so important. Just was talking to another friend who was going through the same process with the same publisher. And I was like, look, this happened to me. Don't give up. Just because they say no the first time, right, doesn't mean that you don't have a really good idea. And if you really think it's there, keep fighting for it.
I'm really glad you kept fighting and that we get to, read about this perspective. And you're such an important voice in this space. I feel so honored to get to know you online, and maybe we can go for a winter bike ride one time.
As long as I have like a hot room, sauna, coffee, something at the end.
I'll make sure of it.
I lose circulation very easily. I need to live in a hot climate.
I don't blame you. I do too. Well, the rapid fire section of the show, I have 3 questions for you. Number 1, if you were a bicycle, what kind of bicycle would you be?
Oh my gosh. And so I've listened to your previous podcast, so I knew this was coming, and I've been going through this back and forth in my head because I have my favorite, my irrational bike that I love that is not a practical bike, but I don't think it necessarily, it's called Fang. It's a track bike for racing on the track. It's very light. It has a little brake on it now, but you take the brake off when you're racing. So maybe that's me. That's my bike that I'm irrationally attached to. On a practical level, the bike that I use, and it's probably me in a sort of more a reality check of what my life is like, is a Turn GSD, which I use to haul myself and the kid and a lot of groceries around, and have gone. It was Seattle's super hilly, so every couple months we have to replace the brake pads because we're braking going down
it must
these
be
hills.
On fire sometimes. Yeah.
So that is sort of my fantasy projection of my bike and myself as a bike and the reality check.
I love it. I think that's my favorite answer so far. Second question is, what is your superpower?
I mean, this is like also sort of trite, but I think, having been born with my disability, right? Like that is my unique perspective on the world, and, what I can offer the world, right, is coming to it from this viewpoint. And so I definitely view that as my superpower.
What is your book recommendation by a female author? You can't recommend yourself today, though you have been the star of the show many times.
Oh. I just finished, and I tried to read it, and it was so dense. It's, and I love reading, but this was a book that I had to listen to on tape to be able to get through. But Movement, by Nicole Gelinas. It's about the history of New York transportation, and really through the ages, and sort of how cars almost became totally dominant in the city, and sort of the pushback and the history of the subway system. And I found it intriguing as someone who's sort of in the trenches right now, and a lot of fights around transportation funding and transportation resources and highway expansions and transit expansions, and light rail expansions, and sort of just all the sort of the politics of those conversations. And for me, like seeing that historical perspective on a whole bunch of different fights through the history of New York was super interesting. I think it would be interesting to folks who haven't lived in New York too, and are less sort of deeply steeped in that history. But I was super into that book. It's incredibly dense, so I recommend if you try to pick it up and you can't get through it, which was my initial reaction, try listening to it, because it may be it's really wonderful and interesting sort of historical perspectives on how things, the way things went down, and then the people who were fighting.
I love it. And I love that you say to do the audiobook, because that's my go-to, because there's so much going on all the time. I always try to do an audiobook. And your book was actually the first one that I actually had to read in a long time, because there was no audiobook.
I know. That's my one big regret about, the way things, Island Press doesn't do audiobooks. And so,
I know mine is not coming out in audiobook either, because Great Plains doesn't do audiobooks. And I'm like, I'll just record it myself. I know that there were people who want the audio.
One way to get around this is, so my book actually is getting an audio production by the Talking Book and Braille Library. So it'll be available for folks who have access to that service as an audio version. So the process has taken a little longer, unfortunately, because of federal cuts to our library services and state funding cuts, but it is coming out. And so you could request, if you are in touch with folks at and again, I'm not sure the Canadian equivalent, but of basically the libraries for the blind will probably be able to record it and make it available to folks who have access to their services. So it's not more widely available,
right.
But it definitely is available for folks who really need that audio version.
Good to know.
That will be cool.
Good to know.
Yes. Yeah.
I'll look that up and try to see what we can do here. I would love to know now, Anna, what's next for you? What are you working on? What are you passionate about? And how can we find you?
Yeah, so I just launched a new organization called the Non-Drivers Alliance, and it's really a continuation of the work I've been doing in the disability community here in Washington State for the last 7 years. We're going to be building a community among people who rely on transit throughout Washington State, focusing on a lot of smaller towns and rural communities. We passed a piece of legislation last year that will allow transit riders, transit-reliant community members, to be appointed as voting members to the transit boards in these communities. And so that's a big sort of political shift for us. And so we're going to be working on implementing that piece of legislation and getting folks trained up and ready to be on those transit boards. So that's sort of one piece of the work. The other piece of the work is continuing to support the National Week Without Driving, national and international. I know there's a lot of Canadian cities that participate. I'm hiring Ruth Rosas, who's been coordinating that work at America Walks, and her time there is coming to an end, and so she's going to come work with me, and continuing to sort of grow that movement which really is a way to sort of highlight what non-drivers need in our communities and where there are gaps and barriers in our current systems and where things are working and what we can do as communities to make sure that everyone can get where they need to go. So I'm excited about this work. It's a new sort of chapter of advocacy for me and a little bit more nimble organization that'll be fun to see how we can have impact.
I am going to keep an eye on this because we need more of that here as well. We need more advocacy around non-driving that doesn't involve the B word, bicycles, because the minute you introduce the B word, everything becomes so political for some reason. So I'm going to be paying attention to that. I'm going to put a link, whatever links you want me to, on the show notes about this.
Nondrivers.org and weekwithoutdriving.org. So those are the good ones.
Nondrivers.org and
weekwithoutdriving.org.
Okay, I love it.
Yes.
And then we're going to catch up in about a year or so, and you're going to tell me how things are going with your new organization. I'm so honored. Honestly, I'm so excited that we got to speak. It's so important to, amplify women's voices. We know we have a voice, but we just need to amplify each other and make sure that the world is learning about some of these issues that we have that may be similar, but may be slightly unique to our situation. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for having this wonderful space and podcast.
You see what I mean? Anna is a queen. And I was a little bit flattered when she said that she's listened to the podcast before. Here I thought it was just you and me this whole time. One person that I mentioned in the podcast is our local Paralympic, Kirby Cote. Kirby is one of Canada's most decorated Paralympians, winning an astonishing 13 Paralympic medals, including 7 gold medals. From the Canadian Paralympic Athletes website, Kirby Cote was inducted into Canada's Sports Hall of Fame among the 2024 class of athletes. In 2018, Kirby was inducted into the Manitoba Sports Hall of Fame. Kirby Cote has always said swimming helped her be just another kid as she was growing up, but her accomplishments in the sport of para-swimming have placed her in a class of her own. Kirby, if you're listening, I'd love to talk to you on the podcast. No pressure, but we'd love to hear your story from you. And that's it. This was my 20th episode, and I'd like to thank all of you who listen faithfully and even those who only listen periodically. A special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Andrew, Michael, Nikki, Halls Emporium, Tim, Luke, Linda, Rod, Julia, David, Stephanie, Jason, Cassie, Emma, Misty, and this week's brand new supporter, Adam. I have more great episodes already recorded coming to you soon, but for now, that's her problem.